Now let's have a look at a specific example of a task 1. You should spend 20 minutes roughly on this task, and you should write at least 150 words, and at the left hand side you can see that you are instructed to write your report for a university lecturer. But this university lecturer, as I said just now, is not a specialist in this subject, so write using general vocabulary but appropriate vocabulary. So what do we have? We have a column graph which shows 4 modes of transport which people used to travel to and from work in one European city in 3 different years: 1950, 1970 and 1990. How should you approach a task like this one? Well, the first thing to do is to try to identify the main trends for each of the 4 modes of transport. Try to identify any large increases or decreases. Are there any clear and consistent directions? Does anything seem surprising? And lastly, are there any clear relationships between the modes of transport or the percentages? Here is one possible answer for this task 1. The graph shows the percentage of travellers in a European city who commuted to and from work by bus, by car, by bike and on foot in 1950, 1970 and 1990. The number of people using cars grew considerably, rising from just over 5% in 1950 to 25% in 1970, and then climbing to almost 40% by 1990. However, the number of people using bikes decreased. Over a quarter of commuters cycled in 1950, but this had fallen to less than 10% by 1990. Similarly, the number of people walking to work fell from more than a third in 1950 to about 1 in 10 in 1990. The number of people using buses initially rose in 1970 to about 30%, but had dropped to about 17% by 1990. The graph indicates the growing use of cars for commuting and the corresponding fall in the popularity of other modes of transport since 1950. Now let's have a look at this answer in more detail. First of all, the introduction. The graph shows the percentage of travellers in a European city who commuted to and from work by bus, by car, by bike and on foot in 1950, 1970 and 1990. Most of this is fairly obvious, but I would point out that the repetition of by bus, by car and by bike is deliberate because on foot does not follow the same pattern. The most striking feature of this graph is the increase in car usage, so let's deal with that first. The number of people using cars grew considerably, rising from just over 5% in 1950 to 25% in 1970 and then climbing to almost 40% by 1990. Now we can make a contrast with the rise in car usage by looking at the fall in bicycles and people travelling on foot. However, the number of people using bikes decreased. Over a quarter of commuters cycled in 1950, but this had fallen to less than 10% by 1990. Similarly, the number of people walking to work fell from more than a third in 1950 to about 1 in 10 in 1990. And the last thing we need to look at is the pattern with the buses. The number of people using buses initially rose in 1970 to about 30%, but had dropped to about 17% by 1990. And finally, we can come to a conclusion. We can say The graph indicates the growing use of cars for commuting and the corresponding fall in the popularity of other modes of transport since 1950. That was task 1. What about task 2? Task 2 is assessed rather differently, as you might expect. The most important thing for task 2 is the quality of your argument. Is it logical? Is it well considered? Is it easy to follow? What about the ideas and evidence presented in your piece? Does the evidence really support the points that you make? Is there enough of it to prove those points and to support them so that they stand up to scrutiny? What about the communicative quality of the whole piece? How well do you present your argument? And of course, vocabulary and sentence structure are just as important in task 2 as in task 1. Let's look at an example of a specific task 2. The first thing you should do is to read the question carefully and read it several times. Decide what the focus of the task is. What are they asking you to do? Now, it's as well to note that the first sentence is sometimes, in fact fairly often, background information. The focus of the essay and the actual question come after this background statement. For example, here's a task 2 question. Some businesses now say that no one can smoke cigarettes in any of their offices. Some governments have banned smoking in all public places. This is a good idea, but it takes away some of our freedom. Do you agree or disagree? First thing to do is decide what the task requires you to do. After you've produced your ideas, you need to organize them. Don't produce a list of ideas without any kind of development. Decide on the key ideas. How many ideas can you cover in 150 or 250 words? Not too many. Select some supporting points for each key idea in your list. Think about your own experience. Do you have any further points to add? Then respond to each point mentioned in the task. Don't forget that your answer must be complete. Make sure that you do not misunderstand the question. For example, don't think that it's asking you about smoking in government offices. That's not the question. Don't write about something which is not required in the question. For example, banning smoking completely. It may be very interesting, but is it relevant? Don't answer only half the topic. For example, you write about it being a good idea, but you forget to write about the freedom aspect.